Outset, this is the highest pulpit that I have ever preached from in my life. I'm getting a nosebleed up here. I mean, is it farsighted where you can't see far off? Have I got that right? If you're farsighted, you're in trouble preaching here because you can't see anybody. Y'all feel like you're just way long ways away. So if I peer at you, understand why. Joshua chapter 24 is where we're going to study from this morning. So if you haven't already turned there, please do so. A couple of things while you're turning there. First of all, I appreciate the kind introduction. I have to offer Brother Dale a suggestion in regards to using technology properly, and that is check your dates. The little biography that he read was from 8 years ago. So I've worked with the church at Northwest in Beaumont. We are about to start our 25th year there. So everything else was pretty accurate, but that was kind of interesting. Secondly, I'm going to give you a homework assignment, which is the best way in the world to start a gospel meeting is to stand up on the first day and tell everybody, okay, you've got work to do. But if I'm going to have to work this week, so are you. Tuesday evening, we're going to study from Leviticus. And so here's the homework assignment. Before Tuesday evening, I would ask you to read the first 11 chapters of Leviticus. And if you don't read the first 11 chapters of Leviticus, then I'll have to do it at the beginning of the sermon. And it's kind of like the yes and the no thing. We can either be here a long, long time, or you can abbreviate that dramatically by reading that ahead of time. Seriously, if you would read that, it will help us somewhat in regards to our study Tuesday evening. So if you're a member of this congregation, you plan on being here Tuesday night, and please don't let that keep you away. I promise it. Just read it for me, okay? That would help immeasurably. Thank you for your warm reception. I appreciate your kindness and the comments in Bible class. I hope that the things that we talk about through our study this week will be of some profit to you. Most of us are familiar with Joshua 24 and verse 14 and following, the "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord" section. Joshua was a fascinating character. I think probably we don't give enough credit to him as a significant biblical personage on the same level as we do others that we find fascinating. Moses was fascinating, Abraham was fascinating, David was fascinating, Solomon was fascinating, Elijah and Elisha, Daniel and Zechariah, and they're just all kinds of wonderful Bible characters. But in many ways, Joshua is the most unique. When you look at chapter 24, if you back up to the very beginning of the chapter, what you will notice is that Joshua calls together the leadership in Israel, and perhaps this is more than the leadership, because it says that he gathered all the tribes to Shechem. So this may have been a kind of a national gathering. My inclination is that it probably was. What I want you to notice is that as verse 2 begins, that it says, Joshua said to all the people, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel." When you read Joshua 24, what you need to appreciate is that God is speaking. And I think that that's something most of us just kind of assume as we read. We may not have ever stopped and thought about it. If you go back one chapter previous, however, if you go back to Joshua 23, and you look at verse 1, you notice that this chapter starts off almost exactly like the former, or like chapter 24. It came to pass a long time after the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their enemies round about. Joshua was old, advanced in age, and he called for all Israel, for their elders and their heads and their judges and their officers, and said to them, "I am old, advanced in age." And then he gives a kind of a last speech, kind of what happened this morning. That Joshua speaks on his own to the nation of Israel. And then you get to chapter 24, and whether it's a separate occasion, and I'm inclined to think that it may have been, then he's going to speak on behalf of God. And as you look at those two things together, There's a lot of interesting stuff that goes on. We're going to talk about that a little bit as we go through our study this morning. What I want you to appreciate is all of this is happening at the end of Joshua's life. And what Joshua has to say, and what Joshua has to say on behalf of God, is very significant because of Joshua's life. I want you to think about it for a moment. Joshua was a young man in Egypt, in captivity, when Moses comes out of the desert and goes up to Pharaoh along with his brother Aaron and starts bartering for the release of the children of Israel. Joshua was a young man. I don't know how young, but he was a young man at that point. Which means that when the water turned to blood, Joshua saw that. And when the thunder and lightning rained down with hail and destroyed the crops and the animals in Egypt, Joshua would have been hiding in some house like everybody else to avoid that. Joshua would have been one of the ones in the land of Goshen who had light in their dwellings when the land of Egypt was so dark that the idea is almost that the dark was so penetrating that you could light a lamp in Egypt and it wouldn't show up anything. He watched Moses as he stood on the shore of the Red Sea and said, "Behold the salvation of the Lord." And he watched that water part. And he crossed on dry land. And he stood on the shores and watched the bodies of the Egyptians wash up after God destroyed Pharaoh's armies. Joshua was there when the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night was leading God's people or separating God's people from their enemies. He would have been one of those who went out every day except the Sabbath day and picked up manna for his family. He was there when they finished the tabernacle and the glory of God descended upon it. He was there when they stood at the base of Mount Sinai and God spoke the Ten Commandments. He was there throughout the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness and watched everyone of his own generation die. I'm going to tell you, of all the things that man saw, that may have been the most impressive. I'm about to turn 55, and I'm starting to watch people of my generation die. I'm at that age where that's starting to happen. Many of you have been watching that happen for a long time, and there is something about getting word that one of your schoolmates or one of your friends from youth has passed away, and there is something very sobering about that. This man watched every one of his contemporaries, with the exception of Caleb, he watched them all die in the wilderness. He was there when God parted the Jordan River. He was there when Moses gave his last address. He was there when they stood on Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim and exchanged the blessings and the curses of the covenant. He was there when God destroyed their enemies. He was there when they parted up the land and sent people away. This man saw some fascinating things. And now he's an old man. And he has, ever since they've come into the land of Canaan, been the leader. In fact, for many of these people who would have been children or not born when they came out of Egypt, many of these who would have been born in the wilderness, Joshua was the primary leader that they had known. Yeah, Moses may have been an old man, but if they were born late in the wilderness wanderings, they would have been children, and Moses would have died as they were growing up, and Joshua was their leader. And here they've come into the land of promise, and they've taken the land, and they've defeated these armies, and they've doled everything out, and things are about to change dramatically. Have you ever noticed that the children of Israel are described as faithful throughout the book of Joshua? When they get to Judges, you're familiar with the fact that a generation arises that really didn't appreciate God, and they start drifting away. Have you ever stopped and wondered why that happened? You know, all through Joshua's time, they're acting as a group. They're going through the conquest of the land, and they're either living together, waiting for the armies to finish, or they're together with the armies and they're fighting day in and day out. It's when they all scatter to their possessions and they're no longer together as a group under a solid, strong, a single leader like Joshua. That's when they start falling away. And Joshua, as he gets to the end of his life, and with the wisdom of his age and having seen everything that he sees, he starts to talk to them. And he sends them off in chapter 23 to their inheritance. And he reminded them of the promises of God. In verse 6 of Joshua 23, he tells them, "Be very courageous to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, lest you turn aside from the right, or turn aside to go to the right hand or the left, unless you go among these nations who remain among you. Don't make mention of their gods. Don't cause anyone to swear by them. Do not bow down to them, but hold fast to the Lord your God as you have done this day." Joshua's looking at what's happening, and with the wisdom of his age, he is cautioning his people to remember their God. When you get to chapter 24, he's going to say this all again. Only in chapter 24 he prefaces it with, now this is what God has to say. And when you get to the section we're familiar with, he offers a challenge to these people. Put away, in verse 14, fear the Lord your God, serve Him in sincerity, put away the gods that your father served on the other side of the river and in Egypt, serve the Lord. And if it's evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. The gods that were your father served on the other side of the river, the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. What Joshua says is, I'm leaving, you're all going off to be scattered, it's time for you to stand up and serve on your own. Are you ready for that? I must tell you, folks, we live in a country that prides itself on its independence and its liberty. We live in a country where we hold fast to the very idea that we stand up and do what we want to do. Nobody can tell us. And part of the issue that people are having with our government in this day and age is because we just don't feel like our government is what it was designed to be. We're tired of people dictating things to us. We're Americans. Well, I'm going to tell you something. The idea of standing up independently and living your life the way that you think you ought to live it is not a new concept, and it certainly didn't start with this country. That's exactly what Joshua was saying to these people. And I know he didn't have a crystal ball, but I cannot help but wonder if he's not looking at the situation around him and he's going, all right, I know all you people. We've all been together for a long time. We traveled through the wilderness together. We've gone in and we've taken this land together. And now you're going to live 400 miles away from him. One's going to be up in Dan, one's going to be down in Bethel. These people are going to be off in Beersheba. These folks are going to be up here in Cana. Some are going to be over by the Sea of Galilee, and others will go out of the Jordan River. And all of a sudden, we're all going to be scattered out. Now who are you going to serve? I must tell you, that's the question that face us. Who are you going to serve? I want to make a couple of observations to you, admonitions to you from this passage of Scripture, because I think it's important for us who are already independently minded people to decide who it is that we're going to serve in our life. And you think, well, I've already made that decision. Bear with me, will you? Go back to Joshua 24 and look at verse 15 and the statement that he makes in leading his people. When he says, as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. I want you to notice, first of all, that Joshua makes a personal commitment at this point that he's going to serve the Lord. As for me. That's a kind of ironic to me, because here Joshua's an old man, right? And he's been serving the Lord all his life, and he's sending all these people off. Well, he's going to go off too. He's not leading thousands now. He's going to be off living by himself, and what he's telling these people is, I want you to understand, if you come over to Ephraim where I'm living, you're going to find me serving the Lord. Have you made that decision? This is always kind of an interesting consideration on Sunday morning. How many of you are Christians already? Keep your hand up raise your hand where everybody can see them. You know, this doesn't count. Raise your hand. Now, keep your hand up and everybody look around. Look how many people in this audience have already decided that they're going to serve the Lord. Okay, you can put them down now. Now let me ask you something. Did you make that decision a long time ago, or did you make that decision today? Because if you made it a long time ago, but you didn't make it today, then I have some serious questions as to whether you're serving the Lord. Because this is a personal decision that has to be reaffirmed day in and day out. And that's part of what's going on with Joshua here. Oh, everybody knows Joshua serves God. Yeah, but you're not going to see me now because I'm going to go off to my inheritance like you're going to go off to your inheritance. And the question is, are you going to be off serving the Lord? This morning at worship service, we're all serving the Lord. Oh yeah, I'll put my hand up. Well, what about tomorrow in the office? What about tomorrow at school? What about tomorrow around your friends? What about tomorrow under pressure? What about tomorrow when you're confronted by Satan like we talked about in our class this morning? Is the decision that you say that you have made, is that still the decision that you're going to make? Because, folks, we are personally accountable. And that's not something that, for all of our bluff and blunder about Americans and independence, it's not something we're always real comfortable with. You know what people are comfortable? You know where people are most comfortable? In a crowd. We're social creatures. We like the herd mentality. In a local congregation, we don't necessarily have to do anything to be considered a part of the group. In a family, we can all have our identity that is connected to everyone else's identity. We can fail acceptably when we're with a bunch of people as long as the group is prospering. That's why when you see riots take place, people do things they wouldn't do otherwise. Notice that? Somebody's looting a store. They're not going to loot a store tomorrow, but when the whole crowd is there, then all of a sudden, all that independent determination to stand up and live by a set of principles I've chosen, that kind of goes out the window. So I want you to understand that what Joshua is challenging in these people at the very outset and what he's promising that he's going to do says, when we're away from one another and we're not part of the group anymore, this is what I'm going to do. And every one of us have to make that decision every day. You either have to decide that having obeyed the gospel at one point and having made a commitment to God, I'm going to follow that and I'm going to stay with that, or you have to decide that you're going to make that commitment. There were some of you didn't raise your hand. Oh, you're here because your spouse is a Christian. You're here because somebody's invited you to be here. Great. I'm glad you're here. I do not in any way want to insult your intelligence. I do want you to think about the challenge that Joshua places before us, because the reality is who you serve in your life is your call. And your spouse may be very faithful. It doesn't mean that you're going to go to heaven on their arm. Your kids may be wonderful kids. It doesn't mean that makes you faithful. Your parents, young people, may be wonderful Christians. That doesn't make you faithful. This may be a great congregation. It doesn't mean that you're faithful just because you're a part of it. And I would ask you to reflect upon this. That accountability is a personal thing. Romans chapter 14, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess, and we will all give account of ourselves to God. And I don't want that to be scary. I don't think God intends that to be a frightening thing unless you're in a position where you're going to find yourself condemned. In which case you need to think that through. And the decision has to be as for me, I'm going to serve the Lord. And very often what people will say is, well, now I really don't have to make that decision. Yeah, you do. It's unavoidable. So, well, if I choose not to serve the Lord, then if you choose not to serve the Lord, you've made that decision. You're going to serve someone, though. You may serve yourself. When Paul writes to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 3 and talks about the perilous times that are coming, one of the things that he notes is that people are going to be lovers of themselves. And if there's ever been an age where people are lovers of themselves, it's this age. And very often people who say, well, I don't want to serve the Lord, I don't serve anybody, I just take care of me. Yeah, that's who you're serving. And I want to ask you about your service to yourself. Can you stop death? I mean, just how much power do you have? I'll tell you one thing I've learned as I've gotten older, especially as I've gotten older and trying to raise kids. Man, I don't have much control. Have you noticed that in your life? I don't have much control. I like to think that I'm in control, and I try to make some decisions as if my decisions are going to have consequences that I can predict. But there's just a lot of things I don't have much control over. And the older I get, the more powerless I realize that I am. I don't know everything. I try to tell my kids I do, but I don't know everything. That's why I got married. Tracy reminds me, I don't know everything. Make sure the kids understand. Dad doesn't know everything. I find myself powerless. I can't stop getting older. I can't stop getting weaker. If I get a horrid disease tomorrow, I can't stop that. I'm powerless. And yet I'm going to give my life to the service of whatever I think is best, whatever I think is wisest, whatever I think is going to produce the best things. And yet I find myself completely powerless in so much of life. You know, it's not a wise decision. So who are you serving? You're going to have to make that decision. Well, I'm going to serve mankind. Wonderful. We need philanthropic people. We need people who are willing to go serve in the military and fight for the country. We need people who are willing to give themselves to others. Some of that is part of what we're supposed to be doing as God's people. But I ask you again, where does that lead you in the big picture? Is that going to keep you from dying? We had a discussion at supper last night about legacy. And, your legacy is what you leave behind. Your family, those that are a part of your offspring and their offspring and your influence through all of those people. And all of that's kind of neat to think about. And, maybe your legacy is to do wonderful things in Oklahoma City and they build monuments to you, and maybe they'll take off the Capitol building up here, whatever that is up on the top. Is that an Indian? Is that a Native American up there? Maybe they'll take that off and put you up there. A bronze statue of you because you've done so much for this country. What good is that going to do you when you stand before God and give account of your soul? You see, folks, service is something that we can't avoid in this world. And Joshua begins this charge to these people by saying that this is where you're going to find me. You're going to find me serving God. And I'm going to be serving God every day. And for those of us that have been Christians for 40 or 50 years, like we talked about in class, it is a decision that we live with constantly. So where are you? To go back to 14, and I want you to notice that he goes on to say, or verse 15, goes on to say, not only am I going to serve the Lord, but my house is going to serve the Lord. This is touchy in our day and age. It's touchy because in our culture we have been taught that we're supposed to live and let live, and we need to be careful about what we teach our children, and we need to be balanced in everything, and we not be narrow-minded in any way, and we need to tolerate everything. And I find it kind of interesting that Joshua says, I'm going to tell you how I'm going to raise my kids. I'm going to tell you how I'm going to lead my wife. As a family, we're going to serve the Lord, and I'm going to make that commitment. And I saw some article just yesterday about I think it was a Canadian province that was threatening to take children out of homes that are identified as Christian homes because they were afraid the children were being brainwashed. Well, the reality is God gives us these kids, God gives us these relationships, and we're going to have to decide what we're going to do with them. And we can't be afraid of interfering in their lives. It's always interesting to me when someone says, well, my parents were Christians, and they drug me to Bible class every Sunday and every Wednesday, and we drove all over Oklahoma. We'd drive 2 or 3 hours to go to a gospel meeting, and a guy would get up there and preach for hours, and my parents did that to me, and I'm not going to do that to my kids. Let me ask you something. Did your parents make you brush your teeth? There were 2 things as a kid I hated more than anything else. I hated brushing my teeth, and I hated keeping my fingernails clean. And I'm thankful that my mom made me do both. Dad didn't care, but my mom made me do both things. And the reason that I'm thankful for that is because when I was 20, I still had teeth in my head. You know, I mean, if we're going to follow the same line of reasoning with everything with our kids, if your kids don't want to brush your teeth, are you going to go, well, my parents made me brush my teeth for years, and I'm just not going to do that to them. My parents wouldn't let me play in the street. I'm not going to do that to my kids. I'm going to let them play in the street. I'm not going to make them brush their teeth. I'm not going to make them eat their vegetables. You know, our line of reasoning falls apart when we start looking in other areas. I'm going to tell you what Christians need desperately. They need men who will stand up in their families and say, we are going to serve the Lord. And you raise your kids that way, and if they get old and decide they don't want to do that anymore, you know, at some point, we've already pointed out, the decision to serve God is a personal one. They're going to have to grapple with that. But as long as you're raising them, understand that's your job. And men specifically, we need to step up to that. If you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 6, keep your bookmark in Joshua, and you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 6, something that Joshua heard as God gave this message to Moses, and Moses talked to the people before they went into the land of promise. He heard Moses say, Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 4, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength. And these words I command you today shall be in your heart. Teach them diligently to your children. Talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. Bind them as a sign on your hand, and they will be as frontlets between your eyes. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Same sentiment in the New Testament is echoed in Ephesians chapter 6. The psalmist in Psalm 78 makes the same observation. Parents and grandparents. If you back up to Deuteronomy chapter 4, the same is imposed upon grandparents. Sorry, grandparents. I know what you like to do is sugar them up, give them a bunch of toys, get them all wound up, send them home so mom and dad can be frustrated trying to put them to bed while you grin and think, now I'm getting you back for all those years. I know you think that's your job, but your job's the same job as parents when it comes to our children's future. How much do you talk to your children about God? I'm not suggesting, there are a lot of ways we can do this, and it's a dangerous statement I'm about to make. I'm not suggesting you have to have a family Bible study per se. Tracy and the girls are here, so I have to be really careful about my illustrations. If they weren't here, I'd tell lots of stories on them, but since they're here, I will say this. Tracy's family, wonderful people. First time I ever went to their house when we were dating, 6 o'clock in the morning, they had an intercom system. 6 o'clock in the morning, over the intercom is her mom's voice. Time to come down. I thought, what in the world? So I dragged myself out of bed and I go falling down the stairs, and here's Tracy and her siblings all sitting in the living room. And they had a family Bible study every morning, 6:15, something like that. I have no idea what he talked about because it was 6:15 in the morning and I was on vacation. And to be honest with you, my brothers-in-law and sister-in-law at this point, they probably couldn't tell you what 90% of those family Bible studies were about because it was 6 o'clock in the morning and they hated being there. I tell you what's interesting about it, though, is they all do that with their kids. Over time, while they may not have known exactly what they were studying because of the timing of it all, the import of it stuck. Tracy and I haven't done that with our children. We are the black sheep in the family. What we do is we have discussions at supper time, because that's when we're all together. And the girls make fun of me regularly because I'll start in on some story. They'll bring up something. I'll go, well, let me tell you. Oh, here we go. Life lesson number 324. And we talk about God, and we talk about what God expects, and we talk about what God has to say. We don't do it as much in a formal way, but we do it regularly. And I'm going to tell you something, men. We better be doing that with our families. Not just because our children's soul is at stake, but because our soul is at stake. How many of you, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand. We'd have to go to another. Do you think you can go to heaven without obeying God? I was going to say, do you think you can go to heaven without being baptized? We'd probably have some visitors here that would believe that. And then we'd have to go to another lesson. Do you think you can go to heaven without obeying God? I mean, there are certain things we would think, well, this is a fundamental thing. I'm going to have to do this, or I'm not going to be accepted by God. God's not going to justify me. Which of God's laws do you think that we can ignore? Can we ignore fathers, bring up your children in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord? Can we ignore that one? Because I'm too busy because of work, or because of the demands of my job, or because I love to go play golf, and that's the only time I have, and the kids can wait. I mean, you tell me. Men, are you making commitments for your household? Are you making commitments for your wife? Oh, I know we live in a liberated society, but God expects men to be the head. And that doesn't mean that man is necessarily the decision maker and tells the wife what she's going to cook and what she's going to wear. What it does mean is you better take the lead when it comes to spiritual things. Men, are you helping your wife get to heaven? I've got 3 girls. We can discuss dowry for any of you who have young men that are interested in my 3 girls. And I'm going to tell you what I pray about my 3 girls every day. God, give them a young man that's going to help them get to heaven. And I'm going to tell you something, men, that's our job. And when Joshua says, as for my house, we're going to serve the Lord, he makes a commitment that all of us need to take very seriously. So I ask you if you're doing that. At this point, especially in this day and age, there is always another issue that needs to be addressed, and that is, well, wait a minute. My husband's not a Christian. Or, my husband and I are divorced, and I'm single, trying to raise kids, or just trying to live my life. Where does that leave me? Well, if you turn over to 1 Peter, in 1 Peter chapter 3, Peter makes it very clear that, yes, there may be circumstance where a wife finds herself in a relationship where her husband's not a Christian, and yet God, through Peter, doesn't excuse you ladies just to say, well, I just hope my kids turn out okay, or I hope my life turns out okay. Your responsibilities aren't dismissed. If your husband will not take the lead in your home spiritually, you can still serve the Lord. In fact, you're expected to still serve the Lord, and you're expected to impress Him with your service. To win Him over by your chaste behavior and by your respect and by the influence that God has had on your life. And I'm going to tell you, a difficult marriage can embitter people. It can embitter husbands, and it can embitter wives. And as a result, we can react in our relationships in ways that are completely ungodly. Don't let that happen to you. You may not have had a choice about what's happened in your relationship. Your husband or your wife may have left, and you had nothing to do with it, but you still had the responsibility to serve the Lord, to try to bring your children up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord, to try to guide your household, to try to be an influence upon your spouse who's not a Christian. Are you doing that? Or do you just read what Paul has to say to Timothy about women and their households, or what Paul says to Titus about the older women and the younger women and the way that they're to behave, or what Peter writes to us in 1 Peter chapter 3. Do you read that stuff, and do we give lip service to it, or are we living it? Joshua says, as for my house, we're going to serve the Lord. What God needs and what God's people need are more folks willing to stand up and take the lead in regards to helping others go to heaven. And while I'm not going to take the time to pursue it, you could say the same thing about spiritual families and elders and older men and older women. But let me offer this last point as a conclusion. As for me, I'm going to serve the Lord, Joshua says. As for my house, I'm going to serve the Lord. The last point is the serve the Lord point. And this occurs to me because I see this the older I get and the longer I've been a Christian. It's easy to kind of fall back on this. Well, I made that decision years ago, and if I ever change my mind, I'll let the Lord know. Are you serving the Lord? There's 2 or 3 things that Joshua says in this section that I think are important. If you go back to Joshua to chapter 23, as he's making his personal admonition to them in verse 6, he makes this admonition, therefore be very courageous. I tell you, for those people who had spent, the better part of a year together as a unit, as an army, defeating the enemies of God, and now they're scattered to their family possessions, and it may be across a valley to the neighbor's house, and there may be, a dozen people within a couple hours walking distance. Now a group of people that are together as a unit who are courageous enough to stand up to giants and walled cities, now they're off by themselves. If somebody stood up today and started teaching something false right here in this assembly, my guess is that there are any number of men who could and would stand up and go, I don't want to be unkind or rude here, but that's not what the Bible says. I believe it would happen. Question is, would it happen if you're off by yourself with that same person? And Joshua sees that coming. And so what Joshua says to them is, you need to be very courageous. I'm going to tell you, folks, if we're going to serve the Lord, we need to be very courageous. You young people, if you're going to stand up for what is right and good and what the Bible has to say about anything, you're going to have to be very courageous. Because the more ungodly our society and our world becomes, the more distinct God's people are going to be, and the more you're going to stand out, and the more attention you're going to draw, and the more criticism you're going to draw, and the more courage it's going to take to stand up and say, this is the way I'm going to live my life, because this is what I believe is right, and this is why I believe it's right. Can you do that? Do you do that? It's part of service to God, especially in this day and age. He goes on in chapter 24, in verse 14, to say, I'll also encourage you to fear God. Now I'm going to talk about that late in the week, so I'm going to reserve the majority of those comments for that. But I will offer this little glimpse, this little foresight into what we're going to talk about Thursday. And Jesus says this in Luke chapter 4. You better be more afraid of God than you are man. Don't be afraid of him who can kill your body. You better be afraid of the one that can kill your body and then destroy your soul in hell. And we need more Christians that fear the Lord. In verse 14, he says, serve the Lord with sincerity and truth. And this is the point that I want to conclude on. What are you doing in your service to God? Is the extent of your service to God that I don't drink and I don't dance and I don't cuss and I don't cheat on my wife and so I'm a good person? Do you believe that that's what the Lord meant in John chapter 15 when He said, I'm the vine and you're the branches. If you abide in me, you'll bear much fruit. If you don't bear much fruit, you're going to be cut off and cast into the fire. Do you think that the fruit bearing that God is looking for is what's going on in your life? Or are you adding? As Peter tells us, 2 Peter 1, I'm adding to my faith virtue and knowledge and self-control and patience and godliness and brotherly kindness and love. Are you better at any of that than you were a year ago? Are you a better father spiritually than you were a year ago? Are you a better mother spiritually than you were a year ago? Are you progressing in your ability to help your wife, to help your husband? Are you standing up and voicing your defense of God and Jesus Christ more than you used to? What are you doing? You know, Joshua is not just talking to hear himself say neat stuff when he says, go off and serve God. And it is a challenge. And it is indicative. I can tell by the look on some of your faces. Either at this point you're so drowsy that you're doing good to stay awake, or you're sitting there going, that's a pretty good thought, and I'm not sure how to answer that question. I'm not sure that I can say that I've improved in all of these character issues, or that I'm a better teacher than I was, or that I'm a better child to my parents than I'm not sure. Exactly what am I doing to serve the Lord? When he sends them off, there's an interesting conclusion to what Joshua says here. He tells them, look, I'm going to go serve God. And my family, we're going to serve God. That's where you'll find us. You come up to the mountains of Ephraim, where I'm going to be living till I die. That's what you're going to find. And I want you to be courageous, and I want you to fear God, and I want you to go off and serve Him. And if you look at the end, their response to all of this, and we read this in the Scripture reading, their response to Joshua's challenge is, we're going to serve the Lord. And if you read through the rest of it, have you ever noticed that Joshua says, no, you're not. You can't serve the Lord. Have you ever noticed that? If you read on through the end of chapter 4, that's what Joshua says to them. They say, we're going to serve the Lord. Joshua says, you're not going to serve the Lord, because God's jealous God. And God's not going to forgive you if you go off and don't serve Him when you say you are. And they say, no. We are going to serve Him. We're making a commitment. And so Joshua says, great. I'm going to hold you to that commitment. And so he takes this big rock and he rolls it up under this tree in Shechem. And he points to it and he tells those people, look here. You see that rock there? That rock's our witness. It heard everything that you said. And there's going to come a day when you're going to be held accountable for the commitment that you're making right now. And that rock is the witness. And every time you see it, not only you, but everybody here, all the elders, all the tribes, all these people gathered, they all heard what you committed. We've got witnesses. Now, are you going to stand to it? I'm going to tell you something, folks. There are things that need to remind us of the commitment that we've made to God. Whether it's our spouse, whether it's our spiritual family that we see on a regular basis, whether it's something inanimate. You see the church building. You go downtown and is the 10th and Francis building still there? Is the church building still there? Somebody tell me. Somebody knows. Okay, you drive by that building. Those that date back in this church all those years, there's a monument, there's a testimony, there's a witness that I've decided I'm going to serve the Lord. And those things ought to help us. We ought to help each other. I'm going to tell you, this is what we need, folks. We don't need folks just show up on Sunday morning. We need folks who are going to stand up every day of their life and say, I'm going to serve the Lord. And my children, my family, we're going to serve the Lord. And we're not just going to give lip service, we're going to serve. And I'm going to help everybody else. And I'm going to remind them, we've all made this commitment. Let's go do this. So, there we are. What a wonderful way to start the meeting. Stand up and just chew on everybody. Well, I'm going to tell you, folks. I've been preaching for a long time, and I see what's happening where we are, and I see what's happening everywhere else, and this is what we need. It was a long time ago, but this is what we need. So, I offer you my admonition that Joshua offered us. Choose you today. And having made your choice, let's go serve the Lord, shall we? And let's help each other. And if we can help you this morning with that decision in any way, we invite your response while together we stand and while we sing.